There really is no character quite like Godzilla. Not exactly a difficult thing when you are the greatest character in all of fiction, and ever since his evolution, pretty much having become one of the most peak icons of manliness, only behind Optimus Prime, that is. He is both an entertainer and a destroyer, while at the same time just being the general embodiment of the human condition. Equal parts spectacle and philosophy. It really is a testament to his versatility, how much he's changed, and even to call him a simple nuclear allegory is a massive disservice, as back in '54, he was still so much more. There's a reason I commented on him being more closely aligned to the human condition. He is the culmination of the might, the terror, and the suffering of superweapons, while at the same time being the victim of such weapons. He is the sympathy and the destruction. He's not just nuclear weapons, as they were the superweapons of the age. Rewind the clock a couple of years, the same term was applied to the first missiles, to dreadnought warships, to machine guns, all the way back to the very first human to pick up a stone off the ground. The names and the shapes may change, but do we? This is why I believe that the best Godzilla is the one that you should be as sympathetic towards as you are terrified of. We are the same, both he and us, like looking at a twisted, broken mirror. Happy 71st birthday, Godzilla. I'm Max Allo, your American Allosaurus and dummy dinosaur. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to leave your comments, and the thoughts in the comments below, can't even get that right, and subscribe for more, leave a like on the video, and just, what is your favorite thing about Godzilla? This isn't going to quite be the same thing as what we did last year for Godzilla's birthday, where we talked a lot more about Godzilla's effects on fiction, and this is going to be really more on Godzilla and just how he's changed, where he started, and maybe where he's going after this. Because we're in a very different position, just the entirety of the Godzilla community, from where we were last year. And very much for the better. As a character, not as a concept, I'm a very firm believer that he is at his best when his motives and his reasons are detached and almost beyond humanity's petty, baser existence and morality. He exists above and apart from us. When he is seen as a hero, he has his own driving force and his own reasons to battle. The salvation that we receive is simply an unintended side effect. As a destroyer, it's unintentional, merely a consequence of either a hunger for radiation, an unfamiliarity with his new form and the world he finds himself in, or something to that effect. While rage at his awakening or his mutation can definitely still play a part in it, but not a direct and deliberate, targeted malice towards humanity, one that revels in death. Acting more like a force of nature. After all, the hurricane does not come as good or evil. Its rains may shower parched lands, but its wind and waves will thrash those in its direct path. Much like Godzilla, it doesn't discriminate. It just is. It just depends on your perspective. Though this does not mean he can only work this way. He can be both our deliberate protector and our vengeful slaughterer. However, to do either of these requires a far stronger focus on a compelling human narrative. This is something of a huge weak point within the MonsterVerse and also 98 itself, which does lead to this stigma that heroic Godzilla does not work well, and also the questionable overdubbing, which was deliberately twisted by studios here in the United States for the older movies. But when you compare the MonsterVerse's writing against the more recent Toho works, which have portrayed Godzilla as a much more aggressive, hostile force, you can see how people will make the connection that Godzilla equal Slopzilla. It's misidentifying the root cause, but correctly identifying the symptoms. To most people, the action of the series has always been the main selling point, at least here in the States. And even to a degree in Japan, post the original 54 version. After all, the person who wrote the scenario for the original movie and the follow-up Godzilla Raids Again, Shigeru Kayama, had said that Godzilla had evolved beyond just being the nuclear allegory and into a manga-like figure to entertain younglings. I actually recommend giving his entire essay he wrote about Godzilla. Actually, this actually released back in 55, around the same time that they were making it released Raids Again, which really shows that he truly believed this. This wasn't something that he saw success of and capitalized on later. He truly believed this. It's actually the reason why he left the series following this, because he wanted to trust it to the future of those who would continue making Godzilla content. And the specific diction he used, the just nuclear allegory, means that it doesn't mean he can't be used for that going forward. It just means he doesn't have to. He can be used for any number of purposes. And the series has focused overwhelmingly on this spectacle aspect. Battles between kaiju or humanity's efforts to combat Gojira and other kaiju, despite their hopelessness, are always a big draw. Even in the much darker toned 84, not really quite remake, but reinvention, and even Godzilla -1, they have this. Really, the only exception, to an extent, is Shin, but even then, Shin Godzilla has a lot of flashy fights. Be it in the form of Suitimation or high-spec CGI, it never needed to be perfect. Much like the writing, it just needed to be compelling enough. And I will admit that I do have a fondness for the show era's combat system. Despite the flailing nature of battles, every era does have its flaws, be it writing or battle, if we're being honest. However, it's those flaws, those imperfections, that make them great. Showa's battling style, again, being this flailing, just absurdity, it gives it a unique appearance. Same of Heisei era's B-Mors. The more physical but still B-Mors nature of the Millennium era, and the distinct ability of CGI to allow the MonsterVerse fights to be as spectacular as they are. Though I will say, the MonsterVerse does overly rely on CGI. In kind of a weird way, the MonsterVerse and the Showa era are almost two sides of the same coin. One limited by the technology of its age and forced into that specific style of fighting, as well as the more exaggerated designs of the kaiju appearances, while the other is entirely dependent upon the CGI without being able to compromise and to go back. Though, with regards to CGI, this is a bit of a limiting factor in that very specific and not many computer systems are actually able to render and produce such battles. These do constrain the development of the film and also are partially what make it take so long to produce these movies. In a lot of ways, both led to very creative ways of battling, for better or for worse. You get some pretty silly things like Godzilla flying through the air to fight Hedorah, or the sliding dropkick, while the CGI leads to absolutely breathtaking combat, things of which you would never have been able to do with the suits. It's part of the reason why the Heisei era revolved so much on B-Mors, is the suits were stiff, they were rigid, they couldn't be subjected to the wear and tear that a lot of battles need, which is part of the reason why Godzilla vs. Destroya is so spectacular. It actually does have physical battles. But at the same time, you don't really need super hyperphotorealistic Godzilla. He does look absolutely spectacular, but this does drag production time on, since studios need to share these machines. It may have changed over the last couple of years, but last time I heard, there were maybe only like 5 of these computers that can really handle these kinds of things, and I think most of them are actually owned by Disney. CGI doesn't really need to be, that super high-level top-end tier. There's definitely some questionable CGI scenes in -1, but we don't mind. They are more than good enough. Honestly, as long as they look better than GMK's PS2 graphics, I think we're fine. There's actually a large part of why the Showa retains its fairly unjust reputation, something I plan to cover far more comprehensively in its own video in the future, since this reputation is largely derived from the combat styling and the deliberately poor dubbing when it came to the US releases. After all, if the Showa era were truly this fundamentally flawed, that means all of Godzilla going forward would have been flawed. This saga served as a template for many of the stories and arcs going forward in the later eras of Godzilla, Heisei, Millennium, even the Monsterverse, and elements of Shin and -1. It can't be both ways, with the future eras that heavily reuse material from them being this shining golden pinnacle, whereas the Showa era is this languishing heap of flaw. Heck, there are some movies that came after that reuse almost the exact same plots and premises. The premise was never the problem. In fact, many of it actually even more over the top in later eras. Even many of the movies as late as the Millennium era have these cartoonishly over-the-top combat moments. It was a series that was always relatively silly that does take itself seriously. This bizarre, miraculous combination. Something else especially is the uniquely American disdain that Godzilla receives. This being the American Godzilla disdain of things like the Monsterverse and 98. This is something that I do plan to cover in far greater depth and detail in its own self-contained video, because this is a fairly nuanced conversation, and if I'm gonna cover this entire thing, this section would probably be an hour long itself. But in a more short, reduced format, I'm gonna try and cover all that I can. As especially the American Monsterverse Godzilla's philosophy in the pre-Wingard era is actually far closer to Toho than it is given credit for, though it does rightfully receive its criticizations when it deviates. So it's really just a fixation, which is the problem. And unfortunately, much of the criticism also does come rooted in 98, which is unjust. This is sort of a legacy problem that, by its very nature of being an American-produced Godzilla, carries this unfair baggage. Especially one of the other criticisms that G14 receives is something that also was applicable to 98, which is that it was partially funded by the Department of Defense. Yeah, Fed Boys helped make a Godzilla movie. However, despite the commonly touted problem of American Godzillas being susceptible to our weapons because Americans can't conceive of a Godzilla that is invincible and invulnerable to our weapons, is simply an outright falsehood. Normal weapons simply don't affect him enough. Even in G14, the closest we get is a shell hitting Godzilla in his gills and he kind of recoils, smashing the Golden Gate Bridge, but this is a weak point that the Mutos themselves and other kaiju in later films also exploit. Toho even abandoned Godzilla's invulnerability during the mid-Showa era, though his wounds were caused by other kaiju, not humanity. This concept being wholly abandoned in the Heisei era. This is an era where humanity puts Godzilla on the back foot a lot, and actually is almost a glorification of superweapons, a wholly antithetical stance to the original 54 version. Cadmium easily takes him down in the 84 movie. The Super X2, the fire mirror it possesses, the anti-nuclear energy bacteria, Mechagodzilla and Garuda, and later the Super X3. Two of these would have successfully killed Godzilla, weapons designed by humanity, if it were not for other extenuating circumstances, while the rest of them soundly routed or outright defeated him. While 98 is an illogical escalation, it was hardly unprecedented. And going along with this, and I'm honestly not even sure if I'm going to include this may end up getting cut out, it is the routinely touting of the politics of Godzilla. He is not political, or at least the original is not political, in the way the term is used presently. He always was social commentary. Even back with All Monsters Attack being actually more of an economic commentary on the latchkey younglings, and actually Shin, which is probably one of the closest movies you can say to being political, because one, it's released, and second, it was specifically about the Japanese government's lack of response to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Even those are not written in a way of which the modern definition of what referred to as political means. Since it was specifically, at least in the case of Shin, on the general ineffectiveness and dragging of feet of bureaucracy, rather than a specific convincing of political parties or political stances. It was a call for accountability. Even with 54, while there were political effects made, this was more about the concepts of nuclear weapons and superweapon annihilation as a whole. It was giving that terror, that dread, a form to be better understood. This was social commentary. It's not actively attempting to take a stance in a political thought line and convince you this is the singular correct way. This is because in the modern day, when something is referred to as being political, it is not on the discourse of politics in any form, and the people who say it is political when it isn't know this. This is being referred to in the sense of it is deliberately pushing a political agenda. It is an active attempt to mold the political thinking of the audience to its own goals, rather than to simply introduce thought and allow you to come to your own conclusions. There's a very big difference between what the word meant back then and how it is used today, especially considering the world, even as far as 20 years ago, was nowhere near as hyper-political as it is today. The reality is, the way in which political is used today for media is far closer to the way in which the term propaganda would have been used in the past. Over the 70 years since Godzilla released, that term would have heavily evolved, even if it was political back then. What that word meant in the context of the day is not the same as what it means today. One of the most extreme examples of how diction can just change so drastically is, let's go revisit the Second Amendment. The term well-regulated militia. Back then, that meant well-equipped. Not regulated as in limited in what it can have. If in 250 years, a sentence can almost completely reverse in perceived meaning, imagine what 70 years would have, especially with something that changes as fast-paced as political. And yes, the elephant in the room is, media has become almost a political weapon for convincing audiences within the last decade and some change, thus further distorting its meaning. However, this is a more uniquely American phenomenon. To apply a modern definition of a term to a product that existed far before the conceptualization of it is at best ignorant and at worst deliberately malicious and disingenuous. while it may have been at best political for its era, that term no longer applies, because it has become twisted and contorted into a whole different beast. And I don't want politics of any sort in my entertainment. Be it KODM's confusing, is it pro-climate change, is it anti-climate change message, or something like in Transformers, making a story about this is an if they ever do this, not they have done this, because they haven't. The Autobots believing they need to be armed to protect themselves from the Decepticons as an allegory for the Second Amendment. I don't want it either way. It will just needlessly divide audiences. And to those who will say, well, the original started as this, it will always be this no matter what, even despite the creator having said that it was eventually able to just be pure entertainment. If you're saying that it's always because of the root cause, then that means that King Kong is always racist. Yeah, have fun looking into that one. Godzilla is more philosophical than it is political, if anything. He's a concept. The destroyer, the victim, the entertainer, the icon. That's the reason I say he's the greatest character. Not the best character. Because as a character, his personality is relatively subdued. It's pretty minimal until you get into things like the Heisei era, as the show era, despite having 10 plus movies, they don't really show too much in most of them. Some do show more than others. And unfortunately then you get things like the Monsterverse, where his personality is basically jerked around depending on the director. The Heisei era is actually perfectly emblematic of this as a whole, because while it was shorter, it was far more consistent and slow in transitioning him over the course of about 10 years. One of the reasons why I think that Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 is the best Godzilla movie. But after all, the kaiju are not simply the only element of these movies. The humans are still incredibly important. In fact, they're actually the most important aspect of the movies. Yes, we come for the big city destruction set pieces. Kaiju suplexing each other through skyscrapers, beating each other over the head with office blocks, and occasionally trashing historic monuments. But the humans are the ones of how we experience the story. This is where the American films have often failed. This is, of course, quite frankly, due to a lack of writing ability, which is, once again, something that is not unique to monster films. This is a systemic issue in the Western sphere as a whole, from movies to TV shows to games, books. Seldom is a good product produced these days. If a movie has compelling enough characters, we're more than willing to overlook the flaws, or perceived flaws, in its story. After all, both -1 and Godzilla 14 have their fair share of contrived conveniences when it comes to timing. However, only Godzilla 2014 ends up receiving flack for this because it fails to have us suspend disbelief. It feels like bad writing, when this is just what happens in movies and fiction as a whole. Most movies don't have the monsters or even the antagonist with a GPS lock on the protagonist. This is why when we watch a movie like the original Godzilla, GMK, -1, Shin Godzilla, Godzilla vs. Biollante, and even Terror of Mechagodzilla, these are stories that are carried far more by the human characters than the kaiju. Though it is worth noting in Godzilla vs. Destroya, this is actually one that is carried mostly by Godzilla's character. At the end of the day, the humans are necessary, which is also something I plan to explore in greater detail in another video. It's truly a fascinating series, since despite the wealth of content in the series, the paradox is the larger it gets, the more the conversation seems to want to narrow itself, to homogenize everything into this sameness rather than the variability that built it. And almost the more cannibalistic the audience becomes over it. What people want to see becoming this same cycle of not content on the series, but rather the drama of it. Thankfully, it seems that there are many of the other up-and-comers who are trying to break through this. especially since in the last year, the entirety of the Godzilla community has been upended, especially from the contention of Wingard-led Supernova in the era post-GXK, to the just lack of information on what future Godzilla projects would be globally, to now -1 sequel to Shin Godzilla, possibly Toho restarting making their own yearly Godzilla movies, Wingard being removed as director for Supernova and being replaced, Monarch Legacy Monsters Season 2, and I think I remember even seeing the possibility of a Singular Point Season 2. Heck, even Zilla's reputation has started to see a community-wide redemption. Maybe things are healing. It's just strange seeing just how quickly things change, how mutable everything is. If you guys enjoyed that, please don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more, leave a like on the video, and, just, is there anything that you guys have been doing today? The video actually went on a lot longer than I expected, and probably going to be somewhere between longer and shorter than I expected, but I want to thank you guys for listening and watching to my rambles. There was a lot of this video that actually was left on the cutting room floor. I did not realize how much I tripped over a lot of my words, so the video ended up being a lot shorter than I thought it would be. I know I kind of mentioned there's a couple of other projects I plan to eventually expand out in greater detail, because this is kind of a conglomeration of a lot of those. Don't worry, I will get on those as well. But I'll see you guys next time. Long live the Kaiju King.